On this episode of the End of Tourism podcast,
we are seeing relationships not between people, but between people and images. And so some sort of fundamental human connection is being lost because all we're doing is just relating to images and using images to relate to other people. But that leads to being very interested in taking images that would be successful within the attention economies of a platform like Instagram. And so it can be difficult to not see the world as if from the perspective of what would make a good picture for Instagram.
Welcome to the End of Tourism. Conversations on wanderlust, exile, and radical hospitality. A quick reminder that the podcast lives on a gift economy model, which means that anyone, anywhere can listen, regardless of their economic situation. Your gift ensures it stays that way. Free of advertisements and members-only paywalls. It allows me to devote a great deal of time to this project, to pay for the software and hardware that makes the podcast possible, as well as all of the production and post-production labor. In order to keep the project fed, you can subscribe by making monthly, annual, or one-time offerings at chrischristu.substack.com, where you'll also have access to my writing on these and other subjects including food culture, psychedelics, media ecology, and myth. You can also support us by leaving a review for the pod on Apple or Spotify, by sharing the episodes with your friends, and by following us on social media via the handle, The End of Tourism. On this episode, my guest is Sean P. Smith, an assistant professor in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Much of Sean's research is focused on the relationship between social media and tourism, and how colonial histories shape today's ideologies and visual cultures of travel. The inequalities that result from many forms of tourism development, he argues, are intimately linked with how tourists create content for Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and the ways tourists frame themselves in landscapes and alongside local residents often replay colonial hierarchies. Currently, Sean is interested in how tourism and social media intersect with concepts of nature, and how the global story of tourism and social media is not only one of commodification, but exploitation. The case described in his book project, which traces the recent rise of domestic nature tourism in the Arabian Gulf country of Oman, suggests that, even despite the influence of attention economies, newfound connections with the more-than-human world can develop and even flourish in social media. Welcome, Sean, to the pod. Thank you so much for being willing to join us to speak about your work.
Thanks very much for having me.
My pleasure. I'm curious, Sean, where you're speaking from today and how the world might be housing you there.
Well, it's very rainy and dark. I'm in the southern Netherlands, an area called North Brebant, where I just moved less than a month ago. So many places of moving around, so getting used to this one.
Sean, I found out about your work from one of the pod's listeners who sent in a link to one of your academic articles entitled Instagram Abroad, Performance, Consumption, and Colonial Narrative in Tourism. Now, I've been ruminating on the effect that social media has on tourism, spectacle, surveillance, and cultures of disposability for a long time now. So I'm really excited to speak with you today. And likewise, parts of the podcast are shared via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So there's always this sense of kind of feeding the machine, unaware and perhaps more aware each time. And so first then, I'm curious, why focus on Instagram in the context of critical tourism studies? What makes it different from, say, Facebook or Twitter?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chris. I think with Instagram, in many contexts around the world, certainly not universally, but it's the social media platform that is most readily identified with not just tourism, but the way that people represent themselves engaging in tourism. It's very image driven. Of course, people do write captions. They do engage in other forms of storytelling, but nowadays it's mostly pictures and especially reels, arguably in the last few years. And for a long time, this has been, you could almost say, the dream work of tourism going back 200, maybe longer years. So even though today I think you can find forms of tourism well represented, TikTok to varying degrees on Facebook, Instagram, at least in many of the places where I've conducted research, is the place that one goes to both learn about places to travel and also to show how oneself travels.
Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of imagining that we're more or less in the same age range, but I'm curious if on your travels, you mentioned just briefly that you had also spent time backpacking as a younger person. And I'm curious if Instagram existed at the time and also if this dream work was evident to you in your travels.
It was. I think I was relatively young when I got my first smartphone, but certainly not as young as people nowadays. I must have been maybe 22 or 23. So I did have some years of traveling before I think Instagram really reshaped the way that tourism is done, not just for people that actually use this app, but regardless of whether or not anyone's ever downloaded it on their phone. I think Instagram has had a significant impact the way that tourism is done. So when I first got a smartphone, I was in a period of my life where I was able to travel quite frequently, and that was something that I was really pursuing at the time. And Instagram was a way that I was able to engage in a long-running interest in photography, but also kind of a diary of where I had been, but certainly one that was legible and sort of visible to other people. And it was through that, you could say, performance of travel that I began to think a bit more critically about this app and other social media platforms as well, and the way that it was reshaping tourism destinations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned in your work this notion of the pre-tour narrative. And I'm wondering if we could unpack that a little bit for our listeners and what part Instagram plays in this pre-tour narrative.
Yeah, I'm very happy to point that out. I think this is an important way to think about tourism. And that particular phrase, I'm drawing on the work of Edward Bruner, who was an American anthropologist. And that's also been picked up in other realms to be identified as what other people call tourism imaginaries, just in the work of Raul Salazar. So what this concept of the pre-tour narrative describes is that before people travel to a particular destination, they are exposed to various forms of representation. And oftentimes this is very image-based or narrative-based. So we would see this, maybe thinking back in the era before social media, images encountered in magazines and films, perhaps novels, other forms of storytelling, such as just talking with people who have been to places that one wants to travel. However, with social media, as it's become more integral to the way that people conduct their everyday lives, let alone traveling, it's become the dominant engine for the way that the pre-tour narrative is formed. Many people who use Instagram as a space to learn about places, to travel, they will encounter images of these places on this app, and not just sort of the way that it's portrayed, but what people do in these spaces, the people that live in the places they're going to visit. So this process of the formation of a pre-tour narrative has really always been a part of tourism, but I think it's not accelerated and certainly taken a bit of a different form with the advent of social media.
So on some level, it's not just a question of what you're going to go see, but also how you're going to see it, how you're going to stand in front of that tower or restaurant and experience what's there.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Yeah.
And I know it's a little early in the interview, but I'd like to jump into the heart of the matter and your critiques if we can. You know, you wrote this incredible article, Landscapes for Likes, capitalizing on travel with Instagram. And in that article, he wrote that, deep breath, Instagram's networked architecture and affordances produce three outcomes that circulate and magnify utterances about travel to a degree impossible in pre-networked media. 1. A mediated travel habitus hegemonically informs prevailing aesthetic norms. 2. The scalability of embodied performances entrench the motif's narrative underpinnings. And 3. The monetizable market of Instagram encourages neoliberal notions of the branded self. Now that's a beautiful mouthful. And so I'm wondering if you might be willing and able to flesh out these three outcomes for our listeners.
No, that's brilliant. And it's nice to talk about these things. Perhaps when they're written, it can be quite a bit denser. So maybe we can start with the first idea, this mediated travel habitus. And with the word habitus, I'm trying on the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who theorizes, he's talking about class and culture and ways that people display their belonging within a particular class. And the reason that I'm looking to Bourdieu here is tourism and travel, really. It's important to look at this as a practice that has been connected to what Bourdieu might call the pursuit of distinction, to the search for and acquisition of cultural goods. You know, we might think of cultural goods as being a painting or a taste in a particular kind of music, clothes, a way of speaking even. And when one amasses certain cultural goods and they're recognized as being part of the upper classes, being marks of somebody who is sophisticated, somebody who is typically from a fairly privileged financial background, these cultural goods are desirable. So this background, I think, is important because tourism, from its modern beginnings in the 18th century, has been obtaining these experiences and often physical artifacts that can be a way of claiming a certain social status. So maybe you've discussed this in other podcasts already, but when the Grand Tour began in the 1600s, that really took off in the 1700s, there was this process in which the aristocratic men, young men, were sent on a tour in Europe. And they would go to capitals like Paris, later Vienna, and especially places like Rome, where they could encounter the remnants of the Roman Empire and classical learning. And this was meant to do a few things. In the first sense, it was meant to introduce them to other parts of the world, to certain historical understandings. They could refine their Latin. They could get better at French. And then they could go home and be recognized as a sophisticated member of the aristocracy. And this practice really became quite popular up until about the turn of the 19th century, when it stopped briefly because of wars on the European continent. And then after the Napoleonic Wars ended, it basically exploded. So when we think about over-tourism now in 2020, this was, 1850, 1820s. And this was a period where all of a sudden there are more tourists than ever before. And what that meant is this practice, which had only been done by the wealthiest classes, was now something that the middle classes could engage in. And that produced a kind of anxiety where how was one able to become a distinguished or sophisticated traveler? How was one able to obtain the cultural goods provided by travel if everybody was doing it? So the habitus of tourism, the kind of implicitly learned practices and sensibilities that developed during the Grand Tour, experienced this period of challenge where people had to look for a way to find distinction by other means. And I think this beginning led to this friction where now you see people who are trying to go places that no other tourists go, trying to take pictures that no other tourists have taken, trying to be the only person in a picture of a famous place. So this way of understanding how to be a tourist has become enshrined in the kinds of images that we see in a space like Instagram, to the extent where I think these images are circulating the ideologies of tourism. So scalability refers to, in social media studies, the way in which a single image can achieve a degree of circulation that is not really possible in pre-networked media. So by networked media, we can think of platforms like Instagram, we can think of Twitter, anything where the possibility of likes and retweets or reposts achieves a degree of visibility, what we might call going viral. So what I was writing about in that article was this particular composition called the Promontory Witness, where you have typically one person who's standing on a promontory, or we can say the edge of a cliff, the top of a building, in front of a waterfall, and they're looking really, really small compared to the vast scale of nature. And people see these images and they understand through the mediation, the widespread circulation of these images, that this means something important about travel. And this is what I mean by the mediated habitus of travel, that taking an image like this and being a person in a Promontory Witness image has a particular value. It is a way of claiming distinction, again, in Bourdieu's terms. And by taking a Promontory Witness image, one is able to circulate that image on Instagram in a very different way than before the social media platform existed. So, we think about how images circulated in tourism before Instagram. They would either be, say, in a family photo album that people used to have projectors. People used to maybe send holiday pictures to family and friends, basically whoever they could, show it to. But this is a really, really small circulation, unless somebody was able to get an image in a magazine or some sort of formal publication. But what really shifts with scalable social media is that somebody can take an image and there really is the potential to go viral. I think in Instagram, the potential to have an image seen by a really significant number of people is less than on a platform like TikTok. But there remains the possibility that if I post a Promontory Witness image and I put a geotag in a place that is particularly trendy at this moment, and I put the right hashtags, that thousands of people can witness this image. And because of that possibility, I think there is a degree of enlistment, a degree of interest in participating in this trend, because taking a Promontory Witness picture is going to have much more possibility of going viral, of leveraging these architectures, these scalable architectures, much more so than if I take another image that isn't so popular on a platform like Instagram.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah. So there's a lot in there I'm going to come back to in just a little bit, but I wanted to just finish off this one last part because you kind of mentioned it a little bit, the monetizable market of Instagram that encourages neoliberal notions of the brand itself. And, I pulled this other sentence from one of your articles where you write that as a banal mediator of travel and tourism, Instagram can encourage tourists to imagine themselves as a capital generating brand.
It's really a comment on the attention economy structure of social media platforms, where I want people to see my pictures and I want to get likes. And I say that very much as being somebody who continues to study social media and tourism from a critical angle. When I post something, I'm always aware of how it's going to be received. Some part of me, even when I'm very aware of the issues with thinking this way potentially, is I always want it to gain more visibility. If I post something and it has less likes than something I posted previously, this will likely incur some degree of thinking, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? Maybe I'm just produced such interesting content. And what I think is really taking place there is that we're constantly thinking about ways to achieve visibility in a way that is not dissimilar to the kind of negotiation that celebrities and other public figures have to go through when managing their, what we might in today's terms call their brand, where because there is always this metric of how popular one is, how visible one is, in the form of likes or in the form of reposts or retweets or what have you, it means that we develop a way of always orienting towards this possible public. We're always thinking about the people that are going to see whatever kind of thing we say online. And I think much of the time are hoping that it's going to be received. If not, people are going to like it, if it is going to maybe change the way that people think about something, if it's going to influence them in some way. And Instagram, of course, is like other social media platforms, is monetizable in the sense that when one gets a lot of followers, if I continually create fantastic travel content and I get tens of thousands or more followers, then that means that I am able to start making money from it. I'm going to be paid by different companies to come and stay at a resort or go on some sort of guided tour and take an image or make a reel of this experience and post it on Instagram, talk about how great it was, and then tag the company. And that's a way of them bringing in business. This is how advertising works. So people become advertisers. But even before that influencer level, I think those of us who are not influencers, and I'm certainly not, there's a degree to which we are participating in this logic. Because even if we don't have any designs of becoming influencers, we still want our posts to be liked. And this ultimately influences not just posts we make, but the kind of traveling we do and the kind of relationship we have with the places to which we travel.
Well, contentious at the very least. But thank you for that, Sean, for being able to flesh that out for us. And I'd like to return back to this notion of the Promontory Witness. And, because even before Instagram, I remember seeing in my backpacking years, these same photos, right? The photo of the person of their back to the camera facing the open horizon, whether it be a cliff face or a desert or whatever it is, and spreading their hands or arms. And it's just kind of emanating freedom, I guess. But you also mentioned that this kind of perspective, if you want to call it that, manufactures emptiness because there's nobody else in the photo. And this is so much a part of the kind of, sometimes they're Instagram reels or sometimes they're photos of people, what it looks like when people are at tourist destinations, actually taking the photo in front of the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall or the Leaning Tower of Pisa or whatever. And there's actually hundreds and thousands of people taking the same photo or trying to. And everyone wants to have that photo without anyone else in it. And so just a little preamble to the question. Again, in Landscapes for Likes, you write that this manufacturing of emptiness privileges tourists as the sole consumers of a landscape. And with its residents hidden from view, a landscape is voided of its human and temporal context. Thus abstracted, place is relevant as little but a visual commodity. And then just another quote that I think brings a little something else to the picture is that the Promontory Witness motif scrubs the landscape of the tourist destination of any sign of human habitation but that of the tourist, singularly pictured in a position of mastery that confers possession over the destination. And so there seems to be a kind of shared understanding in critical tourism studies that modern and especially social media-based travel photography emphasizes empty spaces, of course, minus the Instagram user, the person photographed in question. And so I'm curious, why is identifying the emptying of the landscape so important for our understanding? What does it do to us as photo viewers?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think I'm very interested in this composition, which the lone tourist and the landscape, which other people before me have pointed to, and at least John Urry. And I think there are two things happening here. For one, the kind of picture that's due to the mediation of what we can think of as a travel habitus due to the way that people have learned about how to do tourism and to represent themselves during tourism and the most sophisticated way, or in the way that is the most likely to gain them social distinction. They take these images because they've seen these images before, and they're attractive images as well. Maybe they're attractive because we have, through seeing so many pictures like them, we've been taught or sort of subconsciously imbibed the aesthetics as being something that we value and are attracted to. One degree of what's taking place. And to another extent, when it comes to this notion of possessing something, of being the only person that goes there, this kind of image of the tourist being the only person in a landscape or in front of some sort of cultural monument is a way of claiming a symbolic status which links back to this ideology of getting off the beaten track. So I imagine if your experience backpacking and my own is a real interest in getting off the beaten path, of going to places that aren't touristy, of being a traveler and not a tourist. And part of the way that the success in getting off the beaten track is signified is being the only person in a photograph. You know, we as backpackers or tourists don't want to be associated with the tourists. And there's very little better way to represent not being another tourist than being the only person in a particular image.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. And putting together the research for this episode, I came to this kind of possibility, question, consternation, and it arose in this way. And so the next question, which kind of relates to the last one, is, do you think there might be or is a connection here between the emptying of the photo of humans or locals and the emptying of places of humans and locals? And that is in the context of the gentrification of local people and culture in tourist destinations.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point. I think especially because gentrification is aesthetically produced through a kind of emptiness or a kind of minimalism. In a gentrified neighborhood is not something that is crowded. It's some place that there are a lot of wayward signs, wayward quote unquote. It's a space which is typically designed according to what might be understood as a globalized regime of clean lines and interesting fonts and a lot of white space. So thinking about the way that works and everything from upmarket coffee shops to designing neighborhoods that are meant to attract capital and upper middle class consumers and residents, I think that does link quite persuasively with this desire to be the only person within this landscape. I mean, what ultimately is taking place in both processes is that no matter where somebody is going and taking a Promontory Witness picture, there are people who live there. There's people who always lived there and been a part in many ways of the land that is being made into a landscape. And by not including them within these pictures or in processes of gentrification, actually through state-sanctioned programs or other forms of state-sanctioned investment, local residents are being pushed out to make way for different people, the tourist in this case. There is a process of erasure, and often it can be conceived as really a very colonial process of taking over a space and privileging the owners of capital, who in this case typically are tourists. And of course, it's a little bit different when you're taking a picture versus when you're taking a picture in a place that is not considered part of the global north. But tourists typically have a lot more privilege and financial resources than local residents. And when they're not in these images, but the places in which they are are included, then at least when we're seeing pictures of it, how do we imagine who controls the space? How do we imagine who has a right to this space? It would be the person in the photograph, the tourist, rather than the people who actually live, work, and shape these landscapes.
Okay. Since Instagram tends to be the go-to medium for these images and for images in general, as far as social media is concerned, do you think that Instagram then is a tool and driver of gentrification? Could we say that with a sense of coherence?
I think it's as much a tool as many other tools, and it is very easily leveraged to that end by actors who are seeking to mobilize processes of gentrification. And then I think this has been pretty well documented, for instance, in Yu Jang-oh's article, Instagaze, Aesthetic Representation and Contested Transformation of Woljang, South Korea. Well, she was writing about Jeju Island in South Korea, and how once tourists started to take particular forms of images, often of being one person on a beach, then different interests were able to move in and realize the value of this image and find ways to capitalize on all of the tourists that wanted to come and take that same image. So what that led to was the beachfront, where this is largely a fishing community and other sort of small scale, more artisanal economies, was remade into cafes and restaurants and guest houses in a process that I think can be widely recognized in tourism development around the world. But what the author Yu Jang-oh is showing there is that this was largely motivated by the ability to take this image, that a tourist could go and purchase coffee or something, and they would be able to take that image for their Instagram. So there's a really clear linkage there. And I think that linkage can be made in many other places as well. But I think in that sense, Instagram and social media can be leveraged for gentrification as many other tools can be and are being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sean. And so, for the rest of our time together, I'd like to kind of lean on you a little bit for your personal opinion. I know that sometimes working and living in academic worlds, that's kind of something to be left on the doorstep before you walk in. But, you mentioned this notion of networked media and pre-networked media and kind of social media falling into this wider term of networked media. And since these mediums have only come to exist in terms of Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, we're talking 15 years at the most, and then the extension or prototypes of those existing in the previous 10. So about 25 years, maybe. And I'm curious in this regard, I imagine that you're about my age, maybe a little bit younger. So I'm curious if you have a lived memory of how things were before social media and perhaps even before the internet. What do you think we might be losing by virtue of not being able to remember the world without social media?
Yeah, great question. Definitely. Yeah. Very good question. Very, of course, fraught. So I guess for context, I was born in 1988. And so I got to myself 16 and again, I got a smartphone and Instagram and WhatsApp. So I'm really in two minds about this. In the first sense, I think it's important to be aware of how with any new technology, there's a great deal of anxiety and resistance and what might be called panic. And this isn't just social media, or it's not just television, but we can go all the way back to radio, to novels. People were worried about that, to the written word back in ancient Greek era. People were concerned that when we start writing things down, this is going to make it very difficult to remember things, and we're going to be less successful orators, and our reasoning will be diluted because we start writing things down. So there's always this kind of fear of new technology. And part of me wants to recognize that this is just another one of those periods in which some sort of transformative technology comes along, and many of the generation who can remember what it was like beforehand is going to feel varying degrees of nostalgia for that period. That said, it's also difficult to not at the same time say that something really significant has happened, to not feel, I mean, honestly, I do certainly feel nostalgia for periods before social media. Some of the things which I think have been changed is the interest in finding ways to represent oneself traveling. And this isn't to say that whenever one goes somewhere, one is always sort of seeing it as if from the viewfinder, or, well, it wouldn't really be a viewfinder of a camera so much as, one's phone screen. But that leads to, in being very interested in taking images that would be successful within the attention economies of a platform like Instagram, it can be difficult to not see the world as if from the perspective of what would make a good picture for Instagram. There's a lot of different people who've come up with critiques of this process. I mean, if you think about it in terms of spectacle, like Guy Dupord's idea that we're no longer, and he was writing in the 60s, that we are seeing relationships not between people, but between people and images. And so some sort of fundamental human connection is being lost because all we're doing is just relating to images and using images to relate to other people. I'm not so sure about universalizing that idea, but the ubiquity of social media and the challenges to not somehow be on one of these platforms in some even practical way does mean, I think, that there are significant influences in tourism as much as anything.
Yeah, my phone died the other day abruptly. And, I still have this computer that thankfully allows me to have this interview with you. And I can still access Facebook and Twitter, but for whatever reason, I can't access Instagram. And, it's been a few days and I'm really loving it. And then this morning I realized that I had planned to upload a post for the podcast. And then it was like, okay, well, my best recourse of action is to just stay calm and wait. Right? Yeah. And it's a big question. And I think it's something that I wonder if young people, say people born 2000 or after, would be able to answer without having lived in a time without social media, for example. And so this kind of brings us a little bit towards theme of media ecology, which we talked about just very briefly before we started our interview here. And I had taken Andrew McLuhan's Understanding Media Intensive last year. He was also on the pod in season 3. And just generally speaking for our listeners, media ecology, within media ecology, the focus is on the medium and not just the message. It's a way of taking to task the context of our technology and not just the content. And so this manufacturing of emptiness of people and places as brands, and I'm curious, isn't this to a large extent also contingent on our tools, on the limits and architecture of the camera, for example? Do we stop with Instagram or do we look at all social media and later all tools? Because these media exist within each other, right? Instagram is a medium within the internet, I suppose, and then the internet is a medium within the phone. Maybe you could make that argument. It's not to say if we didn't have these things, if we didn't have Instagram, if we didn't have social media, would the Promontory Witness just disappear? I don't think it's as easy as that. But would it be as intensely magnified in our time?
So yes, I think the question of magnification is really what sits at the heart of social media, because if we're looking at the medium of Instagram, then we have to think about photography, and which was invented in the 1840s. And then if we think about photography, we have to think about painting, the way that landscape has been represented in many different cultures, both in painting and Western, Chinese and many other traditions, but then also in poetry and literature. So with all of these things, there's a precedent. And I think if you look at something like the Promontory Witness, this composition and the visual formation of having one person immersed within a landscape or standing at some edge of a cliff has been around for 200 years at least. You can see some in the later 1700s that look like this. But then the desire to be the only person in a particular place, to have gotten off of the beaten track and be the distinguished traveler, that's also been around for a very long time. So that's why I think I'm hesitant to sort of pin the blame on Instagram. And I think my thinking around this has taken a bit of it, not exactly a turn, but it's changed a bit. So I think there's a real tendency to look at platforms like Instagram as only being spaces in which processes of gentrification can gain momentum, or only be spaces where one is almost disciplined into being a neoliberal subject who working sort of subconsciously thinking about how to brand oneself all of the time, specifically in places of tourism, that it's a way that people only think about the pictures. They only want to go take a picture in these places. They don't actually want to have any experiences in this place, relationships to the people there. And I think that really exists. That is absolutely one dimension of what takes place with social media platforms. But as many people I've spoken to say, social media is a double-edged sword. And where that's really been driven home to me has been where I've been conducting research for the past almost 2 years now, sometimes there in person, other times digitally, in Oman, a country in the Arabian Peninsula. I was interested initially because it was becoming more popular as an international tourism destination. So I went there after the pandemic, expecting to meet all these people who were experiencing the problematics of international tourism, as we know well, I think, from your podcast and among other spaces. And there's some of that, absolutely. But what I also found was that in the past 2 years, people who are living in Oman, and this is both Omanis, people who have citizenship, and then also residents. So there's about 40% of the country is made up of people who don't have citizenship in Oman, like many other Gulf countries. And in the past few years, we're talking 5 years, maximum 10 years, there's been this surge of interest in nature, or what we can say is the non-human or even the more than human environment, and what can be understood as domestic nature tourism. And I think like many places around the world, domestic nature tourism in Oman was very popularized during the pandemic when people could not travel abroad. But what this meant is that people saw these images on Instagram, and Instagram is really the most popular app in Oman next to WhatsApp. And that introduced them to parts of the country that they'd never interacted with before. And Oman is this incredibly various and fascinating environment where there's mountains that are, over 3,000 meters high, or 10,000 feet. All of this coastline and with coral reefs and these wadis or slot canyons. And people began to engage with the environment in a very different way, to go on hiking trips, to go on canyoning trips. And social media was this massive part of that. This is where people learned about this possibility. This is where people met people, to introduce them, to take them safely into these spaces. They'd never been on a hike before. Instagram is where they're going to meet somebody to go out into nature with. And it's not to say that this doesn't have problems associated with it. Everything, I suppose, related with tourism does. But I think it also represents a case where Instagram, in this sense, was a way that people are actively connecting to nature. And in a place where, Instagram existed and was widely used before nature tourism was a thing. And I think this kind of flips the narrative a bit, where in Western Europe, where I'm sitting right now, for instance, there's been this long time practice of nature tourism, going back to, again, the 1900s. People started climbing the Alps in the 1850s and so forth. And then Instagram comes along and everybody's saying, people just want to climb the mountain to take a picture. They don't actually care about nature. Well, in Oman, people not that many people were climbing mountains before the ability to take a picture existed. So there's a bit of a different trajectory in which people began to relate to a particular space and to the kinds of experiences that one can have engaging in nature tourism. So in that sense, to go back to your question about what do we essentially do with this platform and how do we address the problematics, I think that Instagram will not be the most popular platform forever, certainly. But social media or this kind of connected media, barring some kind of unforeseen complication, looking at UAI, but this sort of communication is here to stay, probably. So can we find ways in which this space can be generative of community, can be generative of care and ethical forms of travel? What might that look like and what kind of imagery might be associated with it?
I'm curious in that regard. Oman, to me, is someone who's never been and probably, extremely ignorant to any of the nation's culture or history. I imagine modernity to be something of a recent arrival in that place, relatively speaking. Correct me if I'm wrong, of course. And I guess what I'm curious about in the context of your research and most recent research is if you've seen the conflicts that might arise in terms of traditional hospitality, what it means to be in a place as opposed to a landscape, what it means to be a host as opposed to, I guess, a landlord in the Airbnb sense of the word, and perhaps also what it means to be a traveler as opposed to a tourist within the context of these new economic dynamics in Oman. And if Instagram has anything to do with that.
No, that's a wonderful question. It's one I really appreciate as I continue to work there and spend time with people who've been incredibly generous, showing me around and introducing me to what their life is like as people who participate in tourism. The first thing I would say is Oman, the Arabian Peninsula, and really Arabic-speaking cultures generally, is hospitality is one of the most fundamentally important things in social relationships, in what it means to be a part of this culture. One is hospitable to guests, to friends, to family members. It's almost difficult to understate how integral this is. And it is, in many cultures, hospitality is big, but it's very big in this space. And so I think that's a particularly well-suited question to, how is tourism and how is social media impacting this code of conduct and, this really wonderful practice that I think, the rest of the world can stand to learn a lot from. So to your question about sort of where Oman sits in this span of development, oil was discovered in the 1960s and a transformative effect as it has everywhere. And in this time, there was a great degree of urbanization, people looking at services rather than culture trading, which pre-oil economy. And now you see, I think, a couple things. For one thing, cultures of hospitality, I think, were already being disturbed by the way that neoliberal capitalism tends to work, not just in Oman, but anywhere around the world. It encourages people to find ways to profit themselves and to think as individual agents rather than as being part of a community, having responsibilities to other humans, but also non-humans, onto the land, as well as to one's family. So that process is already taking place before tourism began to take root. And I think there are some spaces in which tourism is developing in such a way that's very profit-oriented and where people are incentivized to privilege their own gains over those of others. However, there are other ways, I think, in which people who say we're living in the city are meeting people who live in fairly remote areas under the auspices of tourism. Because they're engaging in tourism, they're meeting people who are living in these spaces and often chatting with them or sharing a meal or sharing coffee or something like this. Sometimes these people who are living in places that are becoming tourism destinations are part of the industry, and sometimes people are not. But as it stands now, it seems as very much a preservation of hospitality within this particular context. With anything, I think the question of tourism is to what extent this will become commodified or not. Like, how do we make money off of this culture of hospitality? How do we turn it into a tourist product? We can sell Oman as being it's hospitable, come meet the locals, but in the way that people continue to practice it, both people who are living in Oman and being domestic tourists, and also people who are seeing tourists come to where they live in ways that they haven't before. To me, it still seems like it's very robustly in place.
Good to hear. And I very much look forward to the publication of your research. Hopefully it'll see the light of day soon, perhaps?
I hope so. Yeah, things are in process for sure.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you, Sean, on behalf of our listeners for joining us today. And, this leads me, of course, to the question of how might they be able to get in touch with you or follow your work, and if that includes an Instagram handle.
Yeah, that's fine. So I recently started another Instagram account. I had my own account and stopped posting about 2019. And then I got interested in it again. I opened a new account, which is sort of more research facing. So yeah, if people want to check that out, it's at SP Smiths. So SPSMITHS, or email spsmith@tilburguniversity.edu. So always pleased to hear ideas and, of course, things that I've missed, because, of course, I have so much to learn in this space. So I would really look forward to feedback and ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll make sure all of that's on the End of Tourism website and the podcast page when the interview launches, and as well as the other authors, researchers, and the works that you mentioned earlier on. So once again, it's been amazing,
Sounds
Sean.
great.
Thank
Thanks,
you so
Chris.
much for being able to really flesh these complex ideas out for us, and we'll see what happens, right?
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the invitation. And as always, I'll look forward to continue listening. This is such an excellent project.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Pod. If what you heard had its way with you, if it left you with more questions than answers, then click subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or directly at chrischristou.substack.com. You can also follow us on social media via the handle The End of Tourism. I'd like to especially thank Alexei Galar for his assistance in the post-production process of this episode and many others in this season of the pod. You can check out his sound design and original music work at alexeigalar.com. If you'd like to support the pod in other ways, we'd love assistance in the form of post-production editing and promotion, or anything else you feel called to offer. Until next time, farewell, friends.